The Rugby Zombies, Chapter 2. The next day, Arwell arrived home from school to find two unusual things. His mum was home, and so was his sister. When Arwell entered the kitchen, they stopped talking, like he was interrupting something. So he went to the fridge and pretended that he hadn't noticed. "What do you want, Arwell?" asked Tanya, who had, he thought, been crying. "Cheese," said Arwell, flatly. "Don't be like that," said his mum, unzipping a laptop bag. "Like what?" asked Arwell, fiddling with the packet. There's no law against eating cheese." He looked at Tanya. Her face was red. She'd definitely been crying. Her makeup was all streaky, and her blonde, straight hair was sticky-uppy. His mum explained. "Tanya's been having a little bit of trouble with Steve." Tanya was always having trouble with Steve. All she ever talked about with her friends was Steve. And they were just the same. Boyfriend trouble was their sole topic of conversation. As far as Arwell could see, they needed their problems. Without them, they'd have nothing to talk about. "I like Steve," he said, slicing the cheese into thin strips. "I've dumped him, if you must know," said Tanya, sighing. "We're just not right together." "Oh dear," said Arwell's mum, plugging in her laptop. Arwell poured himself an orange juice and picked up the cheese. "You'll get back together. You can't have done anything that bad," he said, heading off to the living room. "He only got himself injured," wailed Tanya. "We're supposed to be going to Giovanni's and Steve has gone and hospitalised himself." "What happened?" asked Arwell, suddenly interested. "Who was he playing?" "I'm sick of rugby," moaned Tanya. "There's no doubt that in this relationship I come second. He never puts me first." Arwell had heard this before. So had his mum. Tanya always wanted Steve to put her first. If she wasn't first, then she wasn't happy. Arwell didn't understand her. Nobody put him first, and he didn't mind. He wanted to be first, but he just wasn't. He couldn't even get into the school team. Steve played at district level. You had to respect that, thought Arwell. "Is he still in hospital?" asked Arwell. "Discharged," muttered Tanya. "You should go and see him," said Mum. "I texted him. I said it was over between me and him," said Tanya. "He's so selfish with his injuries." Arwell's mum sighed. She sat down in front of the laptop. Tanya took out her phone and started texting people like mad. Arwell went into the living room and turned on his computer. Glenn was messaging Arwell the real news. Steve had got injured, but he was playing in a trial. Even though he'd had to leave the pitch, they'd picked him. Wales under-19s. Arwell went back into the kitchen. Tanya wasn't crying anymore. She was eating digestive biscuits, drinking tea. "You'll never guess what?" said Arwell. Mum and Tanya looked at him. "What?" they said. "Steve is going to play for Wales." Mum looked at Tanya. Tanya looked at Arwell. "Really?" she said. "Didn't you know?" asked Mum. "I didn't ask. I must have dumped him before he could tell me." A look of mild panic flickered across Tanya's face. She bit her knuckles. She knew in black and white terms that she'd made a mistake. "I've got to go out," she said. And she went. But she was back almost at once. "Arwell, you're coming with me." Before he could wolf any more cheese, Arwell was on his way. Tanya, with Arwell in tow, walked up to Steve's place, which is on a new estate called the Granthams, just behind the supermarket. Steve's house had a front garden and a garage. Tanya didn't want to be seen, so they hung about behind one of the trees in the neighbour's garden while she briefed Arwell. She told him to go and see Steve and talk about rugby. He was to tell Steve that she was really sorry about his injuries and that she didn't want to dump him. Not really. No way was Steve to know that she was outside hanging around behind a tree. Arwell thought that it was just plain stupid, but he liked Steve and he wanted to find out whether he was really going to play for Wales. That was so cool. So Arwell did what he was told. He walked down the drive to the front door and gave the bell a good press. Steve's mum answered the door. She was a tall woman with brown eyes and bright red lips. She looked at Arwell. "You've heard," she said, pointing to Arwell's shoes. Arwell took his shoes off, remembering Steve's mum's thick white carpets. When his shoes were off, she let him in. Her carpets were, he thought, the opposite of her hair, which was short and black. "He's in the living room. No more concussed than usual, I reckon," she said. "Tell him I'll bring him some more tea. Would you like some biscuits?" Arwell said that he would. He liked Steve's place. The carpets were really warm on his toes. Steve was lying on the sofa watching TV. Arwell was careful to find out as much as he could about the trial, the game, the Welsh cap, before he told Steve about Tanya. As soon as he did, Steve was busy texting. 30 seconds later, Tanya was in the front door. 30 seconds later, Tanya was at the front door. In the end, they offered Arwell a lift home in the Fiesta just to get rid of him. On the way home, Steve drove past the Spa. Arwell looked hard for the wheelie bins. They weren't there. That was awesome. Glenn and Martin must have been really busy. When Steve dropped Arwell off, Arwell waited until the car had disappeared round the corner. Then he walked up to the woods behind Martin's house. It was getting dark and cold, and that wind was blowing again. Arwell looked around for Martin and Glenn, but he couldn't see them. It didn't matter, though, because he knew exactly where they'd been, in the old den amongst the pine trees. It was an easy walk because the forest was thick and nothing much grew there apart from the pine trees. The ground was soft, covered with old pine needles and twigs, and Arwell's feet sunk into the spongy, springy mat of needles every time he took a step. Arwell knew his way around the forest and quickly found the old den. There, as expected, stood two great big wheelie bins. He could only just make them out. In the gloom of the forest, in the fading light, they looked alien. He shouted for Glenn and Martin. "Martin! Glenn!" But he heard nothing apart from the crack of trees in that strange, puffy, pine-fresh wind. Then Arwell felt something. A cold breeze from deep in the woods. It was so cold, it just blew straight into him, and he seemed to freeze from inside. Arwell didn't know why, but suddenly he felt very scared, almost as if he was being watched. He stared around him, straining his eyes, but the daylight had gone. He could make out shapes. He could make out the shapes of the tree trunks. He thought he could see things moving between them. Perhaps it was just the branches making shadows in the night. And then there was the sound. The long, ghostly, low moans. Arwell didn't like it at all. Arwell shouted for Martin and Glenn again. But the wind just got stronger and colder, and the moans grew louder, so loud he couldn't ignore them. Without stopping to think, Arwell ran. He ran as fast as he could, skidding on the pine needles, trying to sidestep the trees, following the path out of the woods. He made it, but he didn't look back. He kept running, down one road, down the next road, into the orange glow of the streetlights. After a while, he stopped and glanced over his shoulder. There was nothing behind him. Nobody was following him. He hurried home, telling himself off for being so dumb.